So with that basic before save trigger, it enabled us to add some really basic and simple validation to one of our objects. But we can do some much more interesting things with these triggers on our server-side code, on our cloud code. One useful thing that you do with a lot of these triggers is to add or pre-calculate certain bits of data which might make it faster to run certain queries in the future. Just as an example, so looking at our data, we have the team data and the player data. So one perhaps useful summary statistic we might want for a team is to have the total number of players who are in that team. Now typically to get this information, what we'd have to do is we'd have to run a query for each team to count the number of players in that team. Now that's a pretty expensive query. If we intend to show this number to the end user many times in many places, it makes sense to pre-calculate this number and also to keep it updated. So if I was to add a player, to increment that count of players for that team in the team object. If I was to delete a player, to again decrement that count on the team object. And we can do both of those things again with triggers on cloud code. So to show you how to do that, I'm going to just show you code really on the cloud folder that we have before. So if you look in the triggers folder, we have a file called player. And this is the way I really like to work with triggers in Parse, is I have a folder called triggers and then a file which matches the name of the class. And so for the player class, I would add all of the triggers for that player class in player.js, be it a validation style trigger, so before save is just a validation, or be it some other functionality I'm adding post save. I would add it all in the one file which is named the same as the class. That's just my preference. If your code is even more complex than that, many lines of code, maybe you'd want to break this up into even smaller files as well and just require them into your main.js. So anyway, I've created a player.js file and I've added in a couple more triggers. So we've got the after save trigger and the after delete trigger. In fact, let's have a look at the API for Parse Cloud. So we look at Parse Cloud here. And again, I've said this so many times already, I do recommend you have a look at the API for your relevant SDK and just have a look at just scan through it and just have a look at the functions. Again, all I even expect you to do right now is just to have a scan through of the methods available. So for the Parse Cloud, we have a couple of methods. We've got before save, which we've seen in the validation. We've got before delete, after save, after delete, define, HTTP request, which actually we don't need anymore, but it's a hangover from the old commercial Parse platform. We've got job, which again we don't need anymore. And we've got run and use master key, and I'll show you some of this stuff in the future. But what we're doing is we're adding some triggers for after save and after delete. Let's go back into our cloud code. So I've added a trigger after somebody saves player. So if I was to respond with an error here, it's already been saved to the database, so it's kind of a bit late. So you can't use after save for validation, but we can use after save for perhaps creating summary bits of useful data. Okay, so what am I doing? So now I'm getting the player object from the request. So this is the player that we're actually trying to save. Now player.existed returns true if this player object already existed in the past. Okay, so if that's true, then it means we're just updating a player object. If that returns false, then it means that we are creating this player for the first time. So that's what we care about right now. If we're creating a player for the first time, we want to increment his value, increment the player count in the team. So what we do is, remember that each player has a team reference. So we get the team, we then call fetch to actually load the team data, to load the team object. Remember, it's a relation, it's a one-to-one to another instance, another class. So we have to call .fetch to get that instance of data. And once that arrives, I then call increment, and I want to increment the player count field by 1. And then I want to hit save. So whenever I save a player, what will happen is if it's the first time it's been created, it's going to load the team associated with the player. And then on the team object, it's going to increment the player count. And then it's going to save the team again. And conversely, we also do the same for the after delete. So if a player is deleted for whatever reason, I'm going to get the player object. If it did exist in the past, I'm going to again get his team, and I'm going to increment it by -1, which means, really take 1 away from the team and hit save. So I've already created 2 trigger functions here, and the purpose of these trigger functions is to keep a field on the team called player count, make it accurate to the number of players who are members of that team. Again, I've commented this out in the main.js, so you have to uncomment it. And then if you want to follow along, you just have to push it to your server. So to make sure this is working, what we need to do is we need to just rerun our code that we had right from the start, which bootstraps our players and teams data. So let me load that up again. Load up that JS bin. And at the bottom, so I want it to delete teams, delete players, and then create players. Okay, so now if I clear, hit run. Okay, now everything's being created. If I go back into the Parse dashboard, let me load up this team. Actually, let me refresh, because when you add a column, you sometimes have to refresh to get the new column in. So I scroll to the right, I should hopefully see, here we go, player count. So now for each team, we have a player count. So Man City has 23 players, and you can see that is added up all the way to the bottom. So now, if I was to find a Man City player, so let me find a player who's Man City. Team code equals. And now if I just find one of these players and I just delete them, so I'm going to delete Kevin at the bottom here. I'm just going to select him. In fact, let me just open up the team in another tab so you can see that Manchester City has 23 players according to player count. But if I was to delete one of these players, I'm going to delete Kevin at the bottom there. Delete this row. Yes, delete. Now he's deleted. I should expect the cloud code trigger, the after delete trigger, to be hit, which would then decrement the count for that team. So Man City was player count 23. Now if I refresh, it's now 22 as I expected, because that cloud code trigger was hit because we deleted the player.